All right, so I think this is my clicker. Thank you all for joining today. I hope that I'm not over-promising with this title. Great, so just a little bit about me before we begin. My name is Shelby Switzer. I'm currently a fellow at the Beeck Center for Social Impact Innovation. We're housed at Georgetown University in DC in the US. My background is in civic technology, but also APIs and data infrastructure. I've worked in Code for America brigades across the US, especially in Denver. I have a blog on civic technology and digital public infrastructure called Civic Unrest. You can follow me on Mastodon. You can also email me at any time at shelby@civicunrest.com. Before joining the Beeck Center, I was working in federal government in the US. I'm at the US Digital Service. This is a team within the White House working on kind of cross-agency technology projects and issues. I was specifically working with the CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as well as the CDC during the pandemic, and most recently working on an environmental justice project to use community input to drive data decisions on identifying disadvantaged communities for the purposes of investment. And I've also worked at a couple of startups. All right, so, great. So a little bit about my project at the Beeck Center. For some context, which really informs this talk, I lead up our intergovernmental software collaborative. This is essentially a research and practice-oriented project. We work with students. We also have staff members, a community manager, and a researcher. We have a lot of information at our website. I don't know why the wrapping is a bit weird today. Sorry about that. But if you go to softwarecollaborative.org, then you can see a lot of the work that we do, some of the updates and research, as well as an in-progress list of collaboratives, and I'll talk about what that means in a second. So our hypothesis at the ISC, or Intergovernmental Software Collaborative, is that collaborating with other jurisdictions by default will save governments time and money, while also increasing the likelihood of success of the project, the quality of the end solution, and customer satisfaction ratings from the public, which is maybe a concept you haven't really thought much about, but I think in government we should care about how the public feels about the services we're delivering, and we'll talk about that for sure shortly. And our goal at our project is to try to make the right thing, collaboration by default, the easy thing to do. We do that with research and storytelling, advocacy, and community and capacity building. Look out in February and March. We'll be publishing an in-depth report on funding and sustainability models for collaborative software across governments. I'm really excited about that. We also do advocacy, which basically looks like me speaking at events and talking to a bunch of people about these ideas and working with governments. And we also have a community manager and are focused on community capacity building. So helping governments and organizations who work with governments to actually do collaborative work. So what that could look like taking an open source project they've built and actually making it reusable to other governments. It could look like building a consortium of governments to build or buy a greenfield software project. And we do some capacity building, kind of incubator style work in that realm. But I'm not here to talk too much about that. That'll kind of come up a little bit later. I'm here to talk about APIs and the possibility and potential for APIs to really transform how we interact with government every day and how government functions and works with its citizens and residents. Before we can do that, let's actually just talk about the status quo. We can see maybe how bad the situation is in most places. And let's start with the city level, because really people often live in cities. I'm a city person. I live in Baltimore in the States. I love Baltimore. It's the best city in the country, in my opinion. And I think there's a lot of kind of international lessons to be learned from looking at any city, including one like Baltimore. So what does a city do? Cities can do lots of things. Here's 4 examples of what a city could do. By no means is that even scratch the surface of what a city does. Some cities might have public utilities, like they manage your water system. Some of them, all of them in the US during COVID were and still are tracking COVID cases and also vaccine uptake. They might also be monitoring and managing vacant properties as part of their code enforcement work. And then there's also social services, for example, helping families find affordable childcare. But what one city does is not unique. Another city probably doing like all of the same things, maybe with a little bit of variation in terms of policy. Some cities in the US, the water system might be privatized and not owned by the city, but it is what it is. But pretty much everybody is doing public health, utility management in some aspect, code enforcement, social services, and the list goes on. So while cities often have very, very similar functions, the technology within them that's helping to deliver those services and those functions for the public is super, super different. So here's just an example of what you might find in any given city. In City 1, which maybe is Baltimore, we might have a custom-built system that's helping the government run the water system. This might be by a big vendor, maybe your Deloitte's or Accenture's of the world. And this system might actually be comprised of multiple systems that might be working together or maybe not working together, like your actual usage metering, your billing, your payment systems. Those might all be separate systems within this larger organization. For your COVID tracking, City 1 might have a custom Esri dashboard. For vacant property tracking, they might be using some sort of SaaS product that was maybe built for that purpose or maybe sort of just being reused for that purpose. And meanwhile, in child services, maybe because they're underfunded, they might just be using spreadsheets and paper. Likewise, or actually totally different in City 2, you might have a completely different software stack. For your water management, you might be using a SaaS product that was custom built for this purpose and is being resold. Notably, what I see often in governments is that if you are using a SaaS product that was sold to government, you're not actually getting SaaS pricing. You're still signing enterprise or like private one-off contracts with the SaaS company that might actually be priced wildly different than your neighboring government. So two states might be having the same SaaS product, or two cities, but they might be paying very, very different amounts for it. And there's not that much transparency into it. So something that makes me angry. They also are probably doing COVID, but maybe in DC, for example, they might have a university-built dashboard because the city has a good relationship with the university there. They might have a good relationship with small local businesses who are building some of their software, like for vacant properties. And then maybe child services has a tech budget and is using Salesforce for their client management. Okay, so all of that's super different. All of those systems, super complex, huge diversity in terms of the ecosystem and landscape, even within a city, much less across cities. But let's think about this from a user perspective. What does the public think when they are trying to interact with the city? So here's just one example. This user, let's say me, I was laid off during COVID, and I need help finding childcare so I can return to work. I also just never know when childcare facilities will be closed because of high case counts in my area. Hopefully that won't be a problem again, but that was definitely something happening during the pandemic. And meanwhile, I'm behind on my utility bill payments because I was laid off. Also, unknown to me, social services will actually fast-track my childcare subsidy application. This is my application for monetary benefits to help pay for childcare. If I'm showing signs of extra economic burden, like unpaid water bills, and the utility system will also waive late fees when COVID counts are high. But I don't know any of that. It's not something that's easily communicated to me, and I definitely don't know about the internal services that are happening with the social services team or the childcare social worker that I'm working with. So right now, in this sort of scenario, I, as a user, kind of have to figure all that out somehow by myself, and that might mean actually interfacing with just the 3 examples out of these 4 that I've given. So I might immediately go to child services, work with a social worker who is just dealing with spreadsheets and paper. Maybe they want to know, they ask me if I've been having trouble paying my utility bills, and then I say yes, but I might need some evidence to show that, so then I've got to go figure out how to get that evidence from the water company, or the water organization, public utilities department. And then meanwhile, they're all kind of looking at the COVID dashboard to figure out what exactly I owe, what childcare providers might even be open and available for me to use once I get some benefits and support. So this is awful. And it's awful as a user in the public trying to work with government to do this. Because ultimately the public doesn't understand the city's complexity, and they don't care about it. And it's not their job. They're not public policy experts. They're not city administrators. They shouldn't need to know all the different departments or bureaucracy within the city to just get some basic services that they're entitled to. And this might sound familiar to an API audience because when we usually talk about this concept, we're talking about users and we're talking about systems. Users don't care about your system's complexity, and they probably aren't going to understand it if they tried to, because it's not their job. They're not internal to your organization. So that was all within a city, and you can imagine the complexity and the awful public experience that happens when you try to move to a different city or move to a different state, or even more complicated, move to a different country. So just building on the scenario, let's say all of that happened, but then I also moved to another city to take care of a sick relative. When I try to find childcare and resources to pay for it, this new social services team that I'm working with says that I need a year's history of economic background to get support. But I didn't bring any of that paperwork with me. So now I have to go back to my old city, try to get all that information from them, also looking at my bank account, maybe trying to get some tax statements from the federal level. But it's just so much work. And most people actually just don't go down this path of dealing with all of this work. They don't have time. They're working many jobs. They're trying to take care of their families. So that then results in folks not getting benefits that they need and are entitled to. So that's all really awful. And this is, I'm talking about cities here, but let's take a step back and talk about states and provinces. They might actually be doing a lot of these same things that cities are doing, or they're working with cities to implement some of these things. Maybe instead of looking at vacant properties, they're more focused on eviction relief and funding for housing programs. Maybe they're also involved in the funding of benefits and implementation of other benefits like food stamps. All of that might be coming from the state, but you as an average public user might not know which organization you need to go to for which benefit. Do you go to your city for childcare help, or do you go to the state? How are you supposed to know? Likewise for any of the other benefits that you might be getting. And then you can even take that further and think about this at the country level or at the tribal nation level, where you're doing a lot more than, you're kind of doing a lot of the same functions, actually. You might be regulating water systems. You're probably still doing COVID tracking. People are still doing that, which is good. You might also be doing things like managing immigration and citizen status, and you have a lot more control over the funding of a lot of these programs, because at least in the US, that's a major purpose of federal government, is funding rather than implementation. So we kind of have two problems here. We have a core infrastructure software problem where we have software that's built by lots of different vendors. It's kind of all over the place. It's like the financial cost for these different systems doesn't really make sense, and it widely varies across jurisdiction just based on your relationship with the vendor or how savvy you are with procurement and acquisition, and also with tech. But you also have this data transfer layer issue, where maybe eventually, we do need data transferring across all of these different types of governments, between cities, between states and cities, between countries and states, between countries and cities, definitely between countries and countries, and maybe also in the digital world, or at least from an open source kind of infrastructure perspective, we can have more sharing directly between states or cities of different countries. All right. So that's the status quo. There's got to be a better way, which I'm going to talk about now. Hopefully I have a lot of time to do that, because there's a lot here. So a big part of what I care about is shared infrastructure and services, making shared infrastructure participatory for citizens, making it visible and transparent so people know what's happening, so that people can also participate in it to varying levels if they choose, and also helping states and cities work on this sort of thing collaboratively so that they're not reinventing the wheel, because they are actually doing a lot of the same functions. So a few paths to shared infrastructure and services to help solve the awful status quo. One is collaboratively or cooperatively built or maintained software. So this is something that we're studying a lot at the Beeck Center at Georgetown. You can see kind of an in-progress directory of different projects we've identified across the world. There's obviously a kind of a US bias, but we're hoping to expand that for sure. So if you know of any actively kind of created or maintained collaborative software that's used by multiple governments, please let me know, and you can add it. You can make a GitHub pull request and add it to our website. We also need to invest in open source components and applications, whether those are government maintained or not. So, even those custom-built systems that I referred to, a lot of them are still using open source at some layer, open source components. So we need to better understand what's being used, regardless of if it's just like a small component library versus like a total open source application that's being used by the government, and start to invest in those. So we're seeing a lot more interest and momentum around creating software bills of material. You may have heard that term, or SBOM, to better understand the entire stack and invest in that stack. Creating more kind of investment schemes like maybe grants or honorariums to open source maintainers. But we're also seeing some really cool open source projects. I'm gonna shout out Decidim, which is out of Barcelona. Super cool open source project that is government maintained and government owned. Check it out. We also need data standards. This is like obvious. But even in the States, across cities or across states, there's no shared definition of toddler. So if I wanted to actually do some analysis around families with toddlers who are maybe receiving benefits or not, I'm gonna have to do a lot of work to understand what toddler means in any given place. And that we need to move past that and have some sort of shared vocabulary. We also need shared service APIs that are maintained by maybe a parent government or even just a consortium or association of governments. And we need internal APIs who are enabling agency and interagency systems. So all of these are types of things that I care about. For the sake of this talk, I'm gonna go into a little bit more depth on the API side of this. So with shared services APIs and internal APIs, let's take a look at what some of those look like. So generally, when I think about APIs in government, there's kind of three categories that I'm looking at, and those are primarily to do with the user. So we have open APIs. Those are APIs that are open to anybody in the public. Maybe you have to register for an open API key, but there's no gatekeeping really. That's just so that they can monitor and rate limit you, maybe block you if you're using it incorrectly. So an example of this, there's loads of transit examples of this, but one is RTD's Real-Time Transit API in Denver. They were one of the first great APIs that I ever saw come out of a city, so super cool, recommend it. But we see really cool transit APIs now from a lot of places. And we also have things like the Postal Service Address API that powers a lot of other APIs actually, like the Smarty Streets API. And postal services generally do some pretty cool stuff tech-wise. And open APIs that are for the public, I think, offer an interesting kind of, just look into the history of APIs in civic tech and government, because a lot of these really got started out of the open data movement. They were really just about opening up data that governments use. They're not necessarily about opening up functionality of government. And they have a huge audience. So the public is massive. What are all the user journeys that the public has? So they're often they're really trying to go for bigger audience groups. I think one of the reasons why RTD's API has been really successful is they have a kind of a more targeted audience of people who care about transit and transit developers. Our second category that I see a lot of is this kind of trusted partner API. So these are APIs that a government builds or an agency builds that maybe they're calling open, but you have to be some sort of trusted partner, or you have to qualify for access to the API. So for example, in federal government, I worked on a Medicare data project, API called Data at the Point of Care. The goal of this API was to connect healthcare systems with Medicare claims data of their populations in bulk, so that if, say a doctor is working with new patients, they can just immediately have access to all that patient's prescription info or preventative testing info. They don't have to rely on the patient knowing all of that. But you had to be a registered healthcare organization. You had to kind of go through some pre-authorization processes to get access to data. So you have to be a trusted partner essentially, even though it's a publicly available API. Likewise, a good European example that I'm sure some folks have heard of because it's referenced a lot is a really cool project, just X-Road in Scandinavia and Estonia, working across governments, across national governments. And then an example out of India, they have a bunch of cool stuff happening right now, but one of those during COVID was their COVID tracking app, Arogya Setu. They created an API for companies and businesses of a certain level to be able to have access to employee COVID status with employee consent. But again, you had to kind of meet some qualifiers to get access to the API. And then the third category is internal APIs. And I actually think that these are the most powerful APIs that we can have. And we'll kind of see how that's relevant to cities in a second. But really, like, internal APIs are what's enabling a lot of data transfer within organizations that would otherwise be impossible or be paper-based or require users to go to multiple agencies or even multiple teams within an agency to do anything. So a couple of examples of internal APIs. So obviously, if they're internal, they're a little bit harder to find. Like, you're going to struggle to find an open API specification for internal APIs just published on the web. So you usually have to be kind of privy to, your internal agency's documentation to know about these things. But one example is the Medicare modernization APIs. So in the States, Medicare processes billions of dollars a day, all on mainframe systems. And there is a current project to start to modernize those systems. There's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with the mainframe, but there's lots of issues with maintaining mainframes and having some of these mainframe systems in place. Long testing times, lack of skilled talent to work on them, just to name a couple. So there's efforts to modernize it, and that's using APIs to power that modernization through a strangler pattern to start to just modernize certain pieces of it, putting functionality behind APIs to move the whole system forward. And you might never know about that unless you are internal to the government watching it. Another much more visible example of internal APIs powering something really cool is covidtest.gov. So this was launched last year to help get 4 free COVID tests to American households. So instead of just sending them out, you had to actually go fill out a form online to get them. But there are a number of actual APIs that enabled this website to exist and come into being in just a couple weeks, which is crazy fast for an entirely new government system that's also cross-agency with multiple agencies and stakeholders in place. And it's using a lot of internal postal service APIs that are not accessible to the public, but really drove the ability for this to happen. So just stepping back to just kind of understand some of the forces at work that are enabling APIs to be created in the first place in government. There's kind of 3 categories that I notice a lot. One is legislation. So you do see APIs being legislated, or at least you have laws that mandate data be open. Sometimes you have laws that mandate real-time access to information, which basically becomes an API. And then you also have laws that simply fund interoperability in data exchange systems, which then can manifest once they get to agencies as API projects. You also have internal demands. So speaking of modernization of those legacy systems, you use APIs to make modernization happen. You might have internal business needs to access data across an organization. That's probably very familiar to folks who work in enterprise organizations who are probably doing the same things. That's probably why you have increasing amounts of APIs in your enterprise. And we also have kind of internal demands, but are more policy-oriented. Maybe this should be just a separate bucket, which is just agency policy might say, let's do things API first. Maybe let's do things open source first. And we also have executive orders that are really driving a move to APIs. So for example, the Biden administration put out an executive order, I can't remember the title, but essentially it's the Customer Experience EO, or the CX EO, that is saying that we need to prioritize the experience of the public working with government services, and enable to do that, we have to actually have APIs to kind of remove some of the complexity that users have to deal with. And then third category is just product innovation. Product innovation is happening in government. It's super cool. Sometimes it's industry inspired or trying to be competitive with industry. Sometimes it's filling market gaps. I definitely see, for example, some cities are not attractive to vendors because they're seen as too small. So they often have software needs that are just being unmet because vendors don't want to respond to those RFPs. So that's when they start to collaborate, or maybe like a parent government, like a state, kind of steps in and tries to fill that void. We have more demand from constituent government users. So the CDC, for example, is increasingly working with states to provide APIs or data infrastructure for states who are now demanding more support from federal level. And then also, you can't see it, but just demand from users generally. We see some cool products coming out just through the public asking for them. So finally, I'll just leave everybody with a vision that I hope is a realistic vision and not like a pie in the sky, like amazing, everything is open source and federated. That would be great. But let's see what maybe a city could look like. So instead of this, where we have 2 cities who basically do the same things, instead of having very, very different tech that's also hard to maintain, suffers from vendor lock-in, is not shared, maybe we could have a situation where we have some cooperatively purchased SaaS products so that cities are able to leverage their buying power to get better deals. Maybe we also have a kind of federal or state-powered API that has some open source reference implementations or reusable visualization tools for COVID tracking. Maybe we have an open source product for code enforcement or blight mitigation that's built by and for cities. And maybe we also have the use of some no-code and low-code solutions like Baserow, which is an open source alternative to Airtable, that are then able to connect with multiple internal APIs. So I think all of these are possible, realistic steps for, I think, a better world and a better world for the public at the city level or at the nation level that are using APIs. And then, oops. Finally, we don't want this anymore. We don't want the public having to try to navigate a bureaucracy within a city or within a country or a state. It would be great if they only had to go through a single entry point. Maybe that's 2 child services, maybe it's 2 any of these other ones, but all of those are actually connected and have the information they need to better serve that resident. So, thank you so much. This is a little bit about us.